Keep this priestly hierophant in mind. Keep this cell phone call in mind. Keep that small detail in mind. Keep this concept of memes in mind. Keep our dear Tanya in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep Jay's words in mind. Keep this meme themery in themed memery in mind. Keep in mind, keep this concept of coring yourself out to make room for this sort of persona in mind. Keep it in mind. Keep its pattern in mind. One would benefit from keeping it in mind. So keep it in mind. Keep this motif of the owl in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep poor little Malcolm Graves in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep these motifs in mind. Keep that motif of dead dogs in, actually don't. Keep this motif in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep this concept in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep the mother and her effect on William in mind. Keep all of this in mind. Keep this part in mind. Just keep it in mind. Keep this in mind. We should be keeping this in mind. Keep this thing in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep the concept of a W and an M in mind. Keep this character in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep the fact that there is an aspect to the facial game mechanic that is outside of the player's control in mind. Keep this cafe in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep this question in mind. Keep in mind, keep in mind, keep this in mind, keep this in mind. Keep this boiler lady in mind. Keep all this in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep in mind, keep this possible interpretation in mind. Keep her in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep this blurred link between the fool, the perceiver, or the prince, which is us, the player, and Detective You in mind. Keep this idea of a blank slate husk of William's body, a sort of vessel or avatar for us, the player, to inhabit in mind. Keep this concept of the images not being projected by the projector, but projecting into the projector in mind. Keep that lady in the boiler in mind. Keep in mind, keep this in mind, keep in mind, keep in mind, keep this investigation in mind. Keep this concept of this forest realm being a form of dream realm in mind. Keep this concept of a less than stellar father figure in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep all of this in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind. Keep this demonic phrase in mind. Keep this idea of the first bearer of gold in mind. Keep this number in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep him in mind. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind. Keep this concept of memes and the possible forces that inhabit these memes being entities that require our consciousness. Keep this in mind. Keep this model in mind. Keep this in mind. Keep in mind. Keep in mind. Keep all this in mind. Keep this in mind. I know it sounds silly. We're already this late in the video and we're still keeping things in mind. Keep in mind. Keep this framework in mind. I'll be keeping all of you in mind.